You should have protected her.
I tried.
They said you were there.
Tell me who did it.
You loved her.
I always have.
And you destroyed her anyway?
The forest was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that came with nightfall, where insects hummed and leaves whispered to each other in the dark. This was different. Heavy. Pressing. As though something had passed through this place and taken all sound with it. By the time he arrived, the silence had already settled. He did not slow as he crossed into the clearing, but something in him knew before his eyes confirmed it. The air carried a scent that did not belong to the living, faint but unmistakable. It wrapped around his senses, tightening with every step forward until there was no denying it. She was here, and she was not breathing. He stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just stopped, as though the force that had driven him forward had suddenly lost direction. She lay at the center of the clearing, untouched by the chaos that should have surrounded a moment like this. No signs of struggle carved into the ground, no scattered debris, no violent disruption of the earth beneath her. It was wrong in a way he could not immediately name. She looked still, too still. For a second, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. It reached for something else, something simpler. Sleep, injury, anything that did not end here. He took a step closer. Then another. The world narrowed with each movement until there was nothing left but the space between them. The trees, the sky, the silence. It all faded into something distant and unimportant. Only her remained. Her hair lay softly against the forest floor, untouched by the wind that stirred the edges of the clearing. Her face held no fear, no visible pain. If anything, there was a strange calm to her expression, as though whatever had happened had not been chaotic, but deliberate. That thought did not sit right. He dropped to his knees beside her. Slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might break whatever fragile illusion still existed between what he wanted this to be and what it actually was. His hand hovered above her for a moment, before finally settling against her skin. Cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with the night air. Something deeper. Something final. The breath left him. Not in a gasp, not in a cry, but in something quieter. Something that carried weight instead of sound. His hand tightened slightly, as if that alone could undo what had already been done. See, the word didn't finish. It couldn't, because saying it would make it real in a way that even this moment had not fully achieved yet. His gaze moved over her again, slower this time, searching for something he might have missed. A wound, a mark, a sign that explained how this had happened. There was nothing obvious. No brutality. No chaos. Just stillness. And that was what unsettled him most, because she was not someone who would go quietly. His jaw tightened, something sharper beginning to push through the shock, not replacing it but rising alongside it. A different kind of awareness, one that refused to accept this as random. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't chance. Someone had done this. The thought settled quickly now, taking shape, giving direction to everything that had just been torn apart. His hand slid from her arm to her fingers, closing around them as though some part of him still expected warmth to return if he held on long enough. It didn't. The silence pressed in again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt watched. His head lifted slightly, his senses sharpening, shifting outward, pulling in the details he had ignored in the first wave of impact. The ground, the trees, the air. Something was wrong. Not in a way that could be seen immediately, but in the absence of things that should have been there. Scents that should have lingered were faint, distorted, as if they had been deliberately masked or erased. His eyes narrowed slightly. This had not been left behind carelessly. Whoever had done this had taken their time, had controlled the scene, had made sure it looked like nothing. His grip tightened around her hand. "You should have protected her." The voice came from behind him. He didn't turn immediately. Didn't need to. He already knew who it was. "I tried." The words came out steady, but something beneath them carried strain. Not weakness, not uncertainty. "Wait." That's not what they said. A pause. Not long. Just enough for something unspoken to pass between them. "They said you were there." Now he turned. Slowly. The man stood at the edge of the clearing, composed in a way that didn't match the moment. No rush in his posture, no visible urgency, just presence. Watching. His voice, when it came again, had changed. It didn't rise. It didn't break. It hardened. "Tell me who did it." The air shifted with the words. Not louder, not sharper, just final. Because whatever this was, whatever truth lay buried beneath the silence of this clearing, one thing had already settled into place. This would not end here. Whoever had taken her from him would not remain unseen. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for being here. It truly means a lot. If this story is already capturing your heart, please consider supporting it in a simple way. Subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Your support makes it possible to bring stories like this to life, and I really appreciate it. Now, let's return to where it all began. Before the forest fell silent, before the weight of that clearing settled into something he would never outrun, there had been a different version of him. A man who did not measure his days by loss. A man who believed the life in front of him was steady, certain, and his. And at the center of that life was her. He had not met her in chaos or conflict. There had been no dramatic beginning, no moment that demanded the world shift to accommodate what they were becoming. It had started quietly, the way most things that matter do. She had a way of entering a space without asking for attention, yet somehow holding it anyway. Not through force, not through charm alone. It was something steadier than that. Presence. The kind that made people feel seen without her having to say much at all. He noticed her long before he admitted it. Not in a single moment, but in fragments. The way she listened more than she spoke. The way she watched people as though she were learning them, not judging them. The way her silence never felt empty, it felt deliberate. And when she did speak, it mattered. He had been used to certainty in everything else. Decisions came easily to him. Authority sat naturally on his shoulders. People followed him without question, trusted him without hesitation. But with her, it wasn't certainty that drew him in. It was curiosity. She did not respond to him the way others did. She didn't lower her gaze or adjust herself to fit his expectations. She met him directly, not with defiance, but with something quieter. Understanding. It unsettled him at first. Then it grounded him. Their conversations had started simply. Short exchanges that stretched longer each time, not because they needed to, but because neither of them felt the need to end them. There was no urgency in the way they spoke, no pressure to impress or dominate, just a steady unfolding of thought, of perspective, of presence. And somewhere within that, something shifted. He found himself seeking her out without meaning to, not because he needed her, not at first, but because the space felt different when she was in it. Clearer, more grounded, as if everything else quieted slightly just to make room for her. She never made a demand of him, never asked for more than what he chose to give. That, more than anything, made him give more. There had been moments small, almost forgettable on their own, that became something larger when held together. The first time she laughed, not politely, but freely, caught off guard by something he said. It had surprised him more than it should have, not because it was rare, but because it was genuine in a way that could not be mistaken. The way she stood beside him in gatherings, not clinging, not distant, simply present, as if she understood exactly where she belonged without needing to prove it. The quiet nights where words were unnecessary, where proximity alone carried more meaning than anything spoken, where the world outside could exist as it wanted, because within that space there was nothing unsettled. He had not realized when it became something deeper. There had been no single moment where he stopped and named it. But there had been a point where the idea of losing her stopped being abstract and became something real enough to unsettle him. That was when he knew. She was not just part of his life. She had become part of how he understood it, and she had chosen him. Not because she had to, not because anyone had placed her there, but because she had looked at him, seen him fully, and stayed. That mattered, more than he had ever said out loud. But not everything had been perfect. There had been moments he did not examine closely enough at the time, small shifts in her attention, conversations that ended just a little too quickly, questions she asked that seemed unrelated to anything they were discussing. He had noticed them. He just hadn't followed them, because nothing about her ever felt dishonest. She never lied to him. That was the truth. But there were things she didn't say, and at the time, he had accepted that without question. Everyone carries parts of themselves they don't share fully. He understood that. He respected it. He did not push her to explain things she chose to keep quiet, because what they had felt solid enough not to require that level of scrutiny. There were nights she seemed distant, not withdrawn, but thoughtful in a way that placed her slightly outside the moment. When he asked, she would offer an answer never false, never evasive, but not complete either. "I'm just thinking," she would say, and he would accept it, because she always came back, always returned to him, to them, with the same steadiness that had drawn him in from the beginning. He told himself that was enough. And for a long time, it was. He trusted what they had without needing to dissect it. Trusted her. Trusted himself. Trusted the future that seemed to be building around them without resistance. There had been one moment, one that lingered longer than the others, though he hadn't understood why at the time. They had been standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the main grounds. The light was fading, the day settling into something quieter. She had been looking out into the trees, her expression thoughtful, almost distant. "You ever feel like something's coming?" she asked. He had glanced at her, not immediately concerned, but curious. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away, just watched the tree line, as if she expected something to emerge from it. "Like things are about to change," she said eventually. Not suddenly, just inevitably. He had considered that for a moment, then shrugged slightly. Things always change. She looked at him then, and there had been something in her expression he couldn't quite place. "Not like this," she said. He should have asked more, should have pressed, should have tried to understand what she meant, what she felt, what she might have been sensing that he wasn't. But he didn't, because nothing in that moment felt urgent enough to demand it, because she turned back toward him, and whatever distance had been there softened again, because she smiled, and when she did, it made everything else feel less important. Now, standing in the aftermath of everything that had been lost, that moment returned to him with a clarity that cut deeper than it should have. Not because it held answers, but because it had been a question he never chose to explore. And now, it was too late to ask it again. What they had been was real. That had not changed. But real, he was beginning to understand, did not always mean complete. The clearing did not give him answers, so he went looking for them. He did not leave in a rush. He took his time with the ground, with the air, with every detail most people would have stepped over without noticing. The soil held impressions that had already begun to fade, not because time had passed, but because someone had tried to make sure they would. The marks were there if you knew how to read them. Weight distribution, direction, interruption patterns, more than one set of movements, but not chaotic, controlled, intentional. That alone told him this was not a simple attack. He moved outward from the center, tracing the edges where the forest met the clearing. Broken twigs at shoulder height, not snapped in panic but brushed aside. A faint scent trail that did not belong to the land, but it had been thinned, masked with something unfamiliar. Whoever had been here understood tracking well enough to hide, but not well enough to erase everything. Or they hadn't been trying to erase it completely. That thought stayed with him longer than the rest. By the time he stood again, the picture forming in his mind was already more complicated than it should have been. There had been movement in and out of the clearing, but not a struggle that matched what he expected. No wide disruption of the ground, no signs of prolonged resistance. She had not fought the way she should have, or she had not been given the chance. He followed the faintest trail first, not because it was the strongest, but because it was the one that didn't belong. It led him away from the obvious paths, deeper into parts of the forest most people avoided. The kind of route someone would take if they didn't want to be seen arriving or leaving. It didn't last long. A few hundred steps in, it disappeared. Not faded. Stopped. He crouched again, studying the ground where it ended. The soil was disturbed just enough to tell him something had happened here, but not enough to explain what. No continuation, no branching, just absence. He didn't like that, so he turned back. If the ground wouldn't speak clearly, people would. The first ones he questioned had been closest to the outer boundary of the territory. Guards, runners, people who should have seen something, heard something, noticed something, out of place. What did you see? The question was simple. His tone didn't rise, didn't demand more than the words themselves already carried. He didn't need to threaten them. Not yet. The first answer came quickly. Nothing unusual. Too quick. He held the man's gaze a second longer than necessary. Nothing? There was movement, the guard corrected, shifting slightly under the weight of the attention. But not inside. Near the edge. Thought it was just animals. What kind of movement? Fast, controlled, not scattered like prey. That narrowed it down. And you didn't report it. I didn't think it was important, he finished. The guard didn't answer. He moved on. The next account didn't match the first. There were sounds, another said. Not loud, just wrong. Like something was happening further in, but it didn't carry the way it should have. Why not? I don't know. It felt contained. Contained. That word stayed. You saw anyone? No. But I heard voices. That made him pause. What kind of voices? Low, controlled, not shouting, not panic, more like orders. That didn't align with an uncontrolled attack. More than one? Yes. How many? The man hesitated. At least 3, maybe more. 3 was enough to organize something. More made it planned. He moved through them one by one, taking each account, holding it up against the others, looking for alignment. There wasn't much. Some had seen shadows moving too deliberately for animals. Some had heard nothing at all. One claimed to have caught a glimpse of someone at the edge of the trees but couldn't describe them clearly enough to matter. Another insisted there had been no one outside their own patrol routes. Individually, none of it was reliable. Together, it formed something else. Inconsistency. Not because they were lying, because whatever had happened had been controlled enough to look different depending on where you stood. That meant coordination. That meant intent. That meant someone had planned this well enough to avoid a clear narrative forming afterward. He stood in the center of the reports, letting them settle in his mind, not rushing to force them into something complete. Patterns took time. Forcing them too early led to mistakes. Who was closest to her before it happened? The question shifted the room. A few exchanged glances before one finally answered. She wasn't alone earlier. His focus sharpened. Who was with her? Another pause. Longer this time. Someone who didn't belong to the inner circle, the man said carefully. Name. Silence. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but enough to make the space between them feel smaller. Name. I don't know his name, the man replied, more firmly now. But he's been around before, not often, doesn't stay long. What does he look like? Tall, dark hair, doesn't speak much, keeps to the edges. That wasn't enough. Why didn't anyone question him? He never gave a reason to. That answer landed differently than the others. Not defensive. Observational. As if the man himself didn't understand why that had been enough at the time. Did she know him? He asked. Another glance between them. Yes. That came from someone else. Not hesitant. Certain. How do you know? I've seen them speak, the second man said. Not often. But when they did, it wasn't unfamiliar. Explain. They didn't act like strangers, he said. There was no introduction, no distance, just conversation. How long? I don't know. Long enough to notice it wasn't new. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't empty. It carried something. Something that had not been part of the story until now. He held on to it carefully, not reacting to it the way the others expected. Not yet. Where is he now? No one answered immediately. Has anyone seen him since? A shake of the head. No. Of course not. Whoever he was, he had not stayed. That didn't prove anything on its own. But it mattered. Because now there was something the clearing had not given him. A presence. Someone who had been part of her world in a way he had not fully accounted for. Someone who had been close enough to her to speak without distance. Someone who had been there before everything changed. The hunt had not just found direction. It had found a question. And this time, it had a shape. Long before anyone thought to look for him, he had already been there. Not at the center of things. Not in the places where attention gathered or decisions were made. He moved along the edges of the pack's world, present without announcing himself, familiar without ever becoming part of what people considered important. Most would have struggled to place him if asked directly. Not because he hid, but because he never gave anyone a reason to remember him clearly. He preferred it that way. He had seen her long before she ever noticed him, not in a single moment that changed everything, but in passing, in fragments that slowly built into something he did not expect and never tried to stop. She was easy to notice without trying, not because she demanded it, but because she carried something steady in the way she moved, the way she listened, the way she chose when to speak and when not to. He watched the way others responded to her, the way conversations shifted when she entered them, the way silence settled differently when she was present. She did not force space to open for her. It simply did. He understood that kind of presence, respected it. He also understood what it meant to keep a distance from it. Their first conversation had not been planned. It happened because she closed a space he had intended to leave open. He had been passing through, as he always did, when she spoke to him as if she had already decided he belonged there long enough to be acknowledged. You don't stay anywhere long, do you? The question was direct, but not intrusive, observant, not accusatory. He had paused, more because of the way she said it than the words themselves. I stay where I need to. That sounds like an answer that avoids the question, she replied, not pressing, just noting. He could have left it there. Normally, he would have. But something in the way she watched him made silence feel less like an exit and more like avoidance. "I don't like staying where I'm not needed," he said. She considered that for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if it made sense to her in a way he hadn't expected. "That's different," she said. "Most people stay exactly where they're comfortable." He didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. But he remembered it. After that, their interactions remained rare, but not accidental. They spoke when paths crossed. Never for long, never in a way that drew attention, but enough to establish something that existed outside of everything else happening around them. She did not treat him like an outsider. He did not let himself forget that he was one. That difference defined everything that followed. He saw the way her life began to shift, how her presence became more central, more visible, more connected to things that required her to stay where he never would. He saw who stood beside her more often, saw the way she responded to it, not with reluctance, but with a quiet acceptance that told him she had chosen that path deliberately. He never questioned it, never interfered, because whatever existed between them had never been built on expectation. There had been a moment, though, where the distance between them became something he had to enforce more deliberately. She had found him at the edge of the forest one evening, the same place he often stood when he needed space from everything else. He had not expected her to follow. "You leave without saying anything," she said, stepping beside him without hesitation. "I don't belong to the kind of place that requires explanations," he replied. "That's not what I meant." He knew it wasn't. She stood there for a moment, looking out into the trees the way she often did, as if there was something in the distance she was always measuring against. "You could," she said after a while. "Could what?" "Stay." The word was simple, but it carried more weight than anything else she had said to him before. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. "If I stay," he said eventually, "it won't be the same." She turned slightly toward him. "Why not?" "Because I wouldn't be standing here as someone passing through anymore. And that matters." "Yes." She studied him for a moment, not trying to argue, not trying to change his mind, just understanding. "That sounds like a decision you've already made," she said. "It is." "Then why does it sound like you're not sure about it?" That question stayed longer than the others. He could have dismissed it, could have turned it into something simpler, something that didn't require him to look too closely at what he already knew. But he didn't. Because some decisions don't stop being difficult just because they're necessary, he said. She nodded once, quietly. "I think I understand that," she replied. And he believed her. That was the closest they came to something more than what they allowed themselves to be. After that, he kept the distance more carefully, not avoiding her completely, but limiting the moments where it could become something harder to walk away from. He did not stop noticing her. That was not something he could control, but he controlled everything else. He never reached for something that was not his, never stepped into spaces where he did not belong, never spoke words that would have required her to choose something she had already decided. He saw her with the man who stood at her side more often now, saw the steadiness of that connection, the way it held without strain, the way it fit into the life she was building. There was no reason to question it, no reason to believe it was anything less than real. That made it easier and harder. Easier because it meant he did not have to wonder if she had been uncertain. Harder because it meant she had chosen something he would never be part of. He accepted that. Not all at once, not without resistance, but fully. Because love, as he understood it, was not something that demanded possession. It was something that recognized what mattered and stepped back when it was not meant to be yours. So he stayed where he had always been, at the edges, present, but not central. Close enough to know she was safe. Far enough to make sure he did not become something that disrupted what she had already built. No one noticed him the way they should have. No one asked the questions that would have made him part of the story earlier. And he never gave them a reason to. Until the night that changed everything. What he had believed about her was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. The more he followed the edges of her life, the more he began to see that there were parts of it that had never been meant for the center. Not hidden in the sense of deception, not buried out of guilt or fear, but kept separate because they did not fit cleanly into the life she had chosen to live beside him. The first sign was not dramatic. It was a pattern. Times when she stepped away without explanation, not abruptly, not in a way that drew concern, but with a quiet consistency that only became noticeable when placed side by side with everything else. She did not disappear for long. She always returned. She always resumed whatever she had been part of, as if nothing had been interrupted. At the time, he had accepted it as part of who she was. Now, he began to ask where those moments had taken her. He started with the simplest approach. Places she had been known to go, paths she favored, spaces where she could exist without being watched too closely. The outer edges of the territory held more answers than the center ever had. That was where routines loosened, where attention faded, where people moved without being tracked by expectation. It didn't take long before he found the first indication that she had not been alone in those moments. A section of ground near the tree line showed repeated use. Not heavy traffic, not something that would stand out to anyone passing through once, but enough to leave a quiet impression over time. Two sets of movement, not always at the same time, but often close enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. He didn't rush to interpret it. He followed it. The path led to a place that did not hold significance for anyone else. No structure, no boundary, no clear reason to be there. Just a stretch of forest where the trees grew slightly wider apart, where the ground dipped enough to create a natural enclosure that could not be seen from a distance. A place chosen not for what it offered, but for what it hid. He stood there for a while, letting the space speak for itself. There were no recent signs of use. Whatever had happened here had not happened since the night everything ended, but the traces of the past were still present if you knew how to read them. The ground had been disturbed in patterns that suggested stillness rather than movement. People had stood here, spent time here, not in urgency, not in secrecy driven by fear, but in quiet. This had not been a place for conflict. It had been a place for conversation. That realization shifted something. He did not imagine them meeting in haste or tension. He imagined them standing where he stood now, speaking in low voices, choosing this space because it allowed them to exist without being interrupted or observed. That meant intention. That meant choice. He left the clearing without drawing a conclusion. He needed more than one piece. The next came from someone who had not realized what they had seen mattered. A younger scout, positioned further along the outer paths, spoke with less caution than the others. Not because he understood less, but because he had not yet learned to measure what should and should not be said. I saw her out there a few times, he admitted. Not during patrol hours. Later. Alone? The mate asked. The scout hesitated. Not always. That was enough to hold his attention. Who was with her? I couldn't see clearly, the scout said. They stayed far enough into the trees that I didn't think it was my place to get closer, but it was the same person. I could tell by the way they stood. What do you mean? They didn't move like strangers, he said. There was no space between them that looked uncertain. That phrasing mattered. Not close in the way that demanded attention. Not distant in the way that suggested formality. Familiar. How often? He asked. Not regular enough to expect it, the scout replied. But not rare either. Maybe once every few days. Sometimes longer between. Sometimes closer. And you never reported it. I didn't think it was something that needed to be reported, he said. She didn't look like she was hiding. That settled into something important. She had not behaved like someone doing something wrong. She had behaved like someone managing something private. There was a difference. He let the conversation end there and moved on. Not because he had enough, but because he understood now what kind of answers he needed to look for. Not accusations. Patterns. He returned to the main grounds and began to look at her life from a different angle. Not the moments they shared, not the spaces where she stood beside him, but the transitions between them. The time that connected one part of her day to another. There were gaps, not large ones, but consistent. She left certain conversations just before they ended, not abruptly, but with a sense of timing that suggested she was aware of something else waiting. She avoided certain paths at certain times, not completely, but enough to redirect herself without drawing notice. She chose spaces that allowed her to step away without being followed, places where her absence would not immediately be questioned. None of it pointed to deception. It pointed to control. She had not been pulled into something against her will. She had been navigating something she understood well enough to manage carefully. That was when the conflict began to take shape. Not in what she had done, in why she had done it. He remembered moments that had seemed insignificant before. The way her attention would shift during conversations, not distracted, but aware of something beyond what was being said. The way she sometimes answered questions fully, yet left something unspoken beneath the surface. She had never lied. That truth remained intact. But she had chosen what to share and what to hold back. And she had done it consistently. He returned to the place in the forest again, this time not to find new evidence, but to understand the space itself. He stood where they would have stood, looked at the angles of the trees, the way sound moved through the area, the way the ground absorbed footsteps without carrying them too far. It was a place where two people could speak without being overheard, without being interrupted, without needing to guard every word. That meant the conversations that happened here were not casual. They were intentional, important enough to require privacy. That changed the weight of everything. She had not been dividing her life out of confusion. She had been balancing it. There had been something in her world that could not exist openly alongside the life she shared with him, not because it was false, but because it belonged to a different part of who she was. He did not yet know what that part was, but he knew it had mattered, because she had protected it, not from exposure, from disruption, and that was the difference he could not ignore. She had not been dishonest. She had been complex. And complexity, he was beginning to understand, did not make something less real. It made it harder to see clearly. Now he was starting to see. Before the life she built with her mate, before the structure and certainty that came with it, there had been another kind of connection. It had not been defined by titles or expectation. It had not been placed in front of others or given a name that required explanation. It existed quietly, but it was not weak. It began in a time when her life was less visible, when she moved more freely through spaces without being watched or measured. He was already there then, not waiting for her, not expecting anything, simply existing in the same world without trying to shape it. Their first real conversation did not carry weight at the time. It was not marked as important, not remembered immediately as something that would matter later. It was just two people speaking without needing to be anything more than they were in that moment. "You don't stay in one place long," she had said, observing rather than questioning. He had glanced at her briefly. "Neither do you." "That's different," she replied. "How?" "I have reasons to return," she said. "You don't." He had considered that without answering. She had not pressed. That was how it always began with them. No pressure, no demand, just space where words could exist without needing to lead somewhere. Over time, those moments happened again. Not planned, not arranged, but not entirely accidental either. They crossed paths often enough to recognize a pattern, even if neither of them acknowledged it out loud. Their conversations stretched a little longer each time, not because they were trying to hold on to them, but because neither felt the need to leave quickly. She spoke to him differently than she did with others. Not more openly, not more guarded, just without the layers that came with being part of something larger. With him, she did not have to consider how her words would be received beyond the moment itself. He noticed that. He never took advantage of it. There was a steadiness in him that did not shift based on what he wanted. He did not move closer just because the distance allowed it. He did not change the nature of what they were building, simply because it could have become something else. That restraint mattered more than anything he could have said. There were moments when the possibility of something deeper existed between them, but it was never forced into the open. It remained in the space between what was spoken and what was understood. One evening, they stood in that familiar clearing, the same place that later became part of something far more complicated. At the time, it was simply a place where they could exist without interruption. "You could stay," she said again, not for the first time. He looked at her, understanding the meaning behind the words more clearly now than he had before. "And be what?" he asked. "That depends on what you want," she replied. He held her gaze for a moment longer than usual, then looked away. "That's exactly the problem," he said. She did not respond immediately. "You think wanting something means you should take it," he continued. "I don't." "That's not what I think," she said quietly. "Then what do you think?" "I think sometimes people walk away from things they want because they're afraid of what it will change," she said. He shook his head slightly. "No. Sometimes they walk away because they understand what it would cost." That was where they differed. Not in what they felt, in how they chose to act on it. She did not deny what existed between them. She never pretended it was nothing, but she also never allowed it to take shape in a way that would force a decision before she was ready to make one. And then her life began to change. Her connection with her mate did not appear suddenly. It grew in a way that was visible to everyone, including him. It carried a different kind of weight, one that came with structure, expectation, and a future that extended beyond the present moment. He saw it clearly. He understood it. And he stepped back before he had to be asked. That was the difference between what he felt and what he allowed himself to do with it. He did not compete. He did not interrupt. He did not position himself as an alternative. He removed himself from the possibility entirely. When she came to him after that shift had begun, there was something different in her presence. Not uncertainty, not regret, but awareness. "You've been avoiding me," she said. "I've been giving you space," he replied. "I didn't ask for space. You didn't have to." She studied him for a moment, understanding settling into her expression. "That's not your decision to make," she said. "It is if it keeps things clear," he answered. "Clear for who?" "For both of us." She looked away briefly, then back at him. "You're deciding what this is, without asking me," she said. "I'm deciding what I'm willing to make it," he replied. That was where the distance became real. Not because the connection between them disappeared, but because he refused to let it exist in a way that would complicate the path she had already begun to walk. She did not chase him after that. She did not try to undo the space he created. Instead, she adjusted. She met him where he was willing to stand, not pushing beyond it, not forcing him to cross lines he had already drawn. But she did not erase what they had. That was what made it harder. Because even as she moved forward into a life that placed her beside someone else, she carried that earlier connection with her. Not as a replacement, not as something unfinished, but as something that had shaped her before she made the choices that followed. He remained part of her world, just not in a way that anyone else would fully see. And she chose that. Not because she was trying to hold on to two things at once without understanding them, but because she understood exactly what each of them meant. Her mate gave her something that could exist openly, something that fit into the life she was building, something that could grow without needing to hide. The other man gave her something that existed outside of that structure, something that had formed her earlier, something that did not require a future to be real. She did not choose one because the other was lesser. She chose based on what each connection was meant to be. That was the truth neither of them ever spoke directly, but both understood. And that was why, when everything finally came apart, it could not be reduced to something simple. Because what she felt had never been simple to begin with. The hunt did not stop, but it no longer felt the same. At the beginning, everything had been clear. She was gone. Someone was responsible. He would find that person and end it. There had been no space between those thoughts, no resistance, just direction. Now, every step forward carried something that refused to stay quiet. Doubt. Not about her. That never changed. About everything else. The more he uncovered, the less the story held its shape. What should have been simple kept opening into something else. Conversations didn't align. Movements didn't match what he expected. The clearing itself had already told him something was wrong, but now the details were beginning to agree with it. This had not been chaos. It had been controlled. He replayed moments in his mind, not because he wanted to, but because they would not stay buried. The way she sometimes paused before answering. Not hesitation choice. The way her attention shifted in conversations, not distracted, but aware of something beyond what was being said. The way she stepped away at certain times, always returning, always steady, but never explaining those gaps fully. None of it had felt wrong before. Now it felt incomplete. He had trusted what they had without questioning it. That was not a mistake, but it had left him blind to everything that existed alongside it. That realization stayed with him as he moved. He followed another lead, another path that should have brought him closer to something solid. Instead, it gave him more of the same. Partial answers, fragments that connected, but not cleanly. The kind of truth that forced you to stop and look again instead of moving forward with certainty. He slowed, not because he was lost, because he was thinking. If what he had learned was true, then the man he was hunting was not a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. He had been there before, close enough to speak with her, familiar enough not to be questioned. That alone changed the shape of everything. It meant this was not random. It meant this was not sudden. It meant something had been building long before the night had ended. He stopped walking. The forest around him was quiet again, but not empty. Every sound felt distant, like it belonged to something else. His focus had turned inward, and it was not letting him go. "You're slowing down." The voice behind him was steady, the same presence that had followed him through every step of this. "I'm thinking," he replied. "That's not what you were doing before. Before, I didn't have reason to. And now?" He didn't answer immediately. Because now, the reason was everywhere. He had believed he understood what she meant to him. That had not changed. But he was beginning to understand that what he meant to her had not existed in isolation. There had been more to her life than what she shared openly. Not deception, not betrayal. Something else. Something he had never asked about. "She didn't lie to you." The words came again, calm, certain. "I know." "Then what's the problem?" He turned slightly, just enough to let the questions settle between them. "I thought I knew everything that mattered. And now you don't." It wasn't a question. No. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It held the weight of everything that had changed. He looked ahead again, the path still clear, still leading him forward. But the reason for following it had shifted. At the start, he had been driven by anger alone. It had been enough. It had given him direction without hesitation. Now that anger was still there, but it had to move through something else. Understanding. And understanding slowed everything down. He continued walking, but not with the same force. Each step was measured, not because he doubted where he was going, but because he no longer rushed toward what waited at the end. Because for the first time, he didn't know what he would do when he got there. That thought stayed with him longer than it should have. If he found the man, would he still end him without question? The answer should have come immediately. It didn't. He stopped again, jaw tightening slightly as the realization settled in. That hesitation had not been there before, and it changed everything. He closed his eyes briefly, not to escape the thought, but to hold it in place long enough to understand it. She was gone. That truth had not changed. Nothing would bring her back. Nothing would undo what had already happened. That alone should have been enough to keep him moving the way he started. But now there was more. More context, more truth, more weight behind what had happened. And that made the outcome less clear. He opened his eyes again. The hesitation still there, but controlled now, no longer spreading, no longer stopping him completely. He wasn't done. He needed the full truth. Not pieces, not assumptions. All of it. Only then could he decide what came next. So he kept moving, not with blind certainty, but with something heavier, something that demanded answers before action. And for now, that was enough to keep the hunt alive. He found him where the forest opened into something quieter, a place that did not belong to patrol routes or passing movement. It was not hidden, but it was not somewhere people drifted into without reason. That alone told him enough. This was not coincidence. This was where the path had always been leading. The other man did not move when he stepped into the clearing. He did not reach for anything, did not shift his stance, did not even turn immediately. He stood with his back partially to him, as if he had already known he was coming and had chosen not to meet it with urgency. That lack of reaction should have made it easier. It didn't. Turn around. The words were controlled, steady, carrying more weight than volume. The man did not rush to obey. He turned slowly, not in defiance, not in submission, but in a way that suggested he was not surprised by what stood behind him. For the first time, they faced each other fully. There was no confusion in the recognition, not because they had known each other well, because everything that had been uncovered had already placed them in the same story. "You've been following me," the man said. It wasn't a question. Yes. A brief silence settled, not empty, but measuring. "You took your time. I needed the truth." The man held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that answer had been expected. "And you think you've found it?" "Not yet." That was the difference between this moment and what it had been meant to be at the beginning. He had not come here to act immediately. He had come here because there were still pieces missing. The other man seemed to understand that without it being said. "That's why you didn't attack me the moment you saw me," he said. "If I wanted to do that, this would already be over." "That's not what I meant." Another pause. Not tense in the way a fight would be, heavy in a different way. "You were with her," he said. The words did not accuse. They placed a fact on the ground between them. Yes. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it. For how long? Long enough that it wasn't new. That answer settled into something deeper than the words themselves. It confirmed what he had already begun to understand, but hearing it directly carried a different weight. "You didn't think that mattered?" "I knew it did." "Then why stay close to her?" "Because leaving wouldn't have changed what I felt." The response was steady, not defensive, not emotional, just clear. That's not a reason to remain part of her life. It was for me. And for her? The question held. The man did not answer immediately this time. Not because he was avoiding it, but because the answer required more than a single sentence. She chose her life, he said finally. I didn't interfere with that. That's not what I asked. I know. Silence returned, but it was not empty. It carried the weight of everything that had not been said yet. You were meeting her, he continued. Yes. Without telling anyone. Yes. Without telling me. That wasn't my place. That answer sharpened something. It became your place the moment you stepped into something that involved her. I didn't step into it, the man replied. I was already there. The words were calm, but they carried something that could not be ignored. Explain that. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The man met his gaze, steady, unflinching. She knew me before you did, he said. That landed cleanly, not as a challenge, as a fact. And that gives you what, exactly? He asked. Nothing, the man replied. It just means I didn't appear in her life after it was already defined. The distinction mattered, more than he wanted it to. You stayed anyway, he said. Yes. You watched her build something with someone else. Yes. And you didn't think that required distance. I created distance, the man said. You just didn't see it. That stopped him for a moment, because it aligned with what he had already begun to piece together. You expect me to believe that? I don't expect you to believe anything, he replied. I'm telling you what I did. Another silence settled, heavier now, because it was no longer built on assumptions. You loved her. This time, it wasn't a question. Yes. No hesitation. No explanation. Just the truth. The word did not carry desperation or regret. It carried something steadier. You still do. Yes. That did not change either. And she knew. That was the question he had been building toward, even if he had not formed it clearly until now. The man held his gaze, not looking away. Yes. The answer came just as simply. Everything narrowed around that. Not because it was unexpected, because hearing it made it undeniable. And she stayed with me. Yes. Why? The word came sharper this time, not louder, but carrying something closer to what had been there at the beginning. The man did not rush to answer, because this was not something that could be reduced easily. She chose you, he said. That's not an answer. It is. No, he replied, his voice tightening slightly. It's the result. I want the reason. The man exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition that this was the part that could not be avoided. She chose what she could build with you, he said. Something that could exist openly, something that didn't require compromise to survive. And with you? She didn't have to build anything, he replied. It already existed. That shifted something. Not enough to settle anything. Enough to make it harder to hold on to a single version of the truth. You're saying she felt the same way about you. I'm saying what was there didn't start with you, the man answered. And it didn't disappear when she chose you. The words did not come with pride. They came with weight. That was what made them harder to dismiss. And you thought that was acceptable. I thought it was hers to decide, he said. Silence followed again, but this time it pressed in from all sides. Because this was no longer about what had happened. It was about what had existed long before it ended. And for the first time since he began this hunt, the man in front of him was no longer just the one he had come to find. He was part of a truth that had been there from the beginning. One that could not be ignored. One that would not simplify itself, no matter how much he might have wanted it to. The night was still, almost unbearably so, as he stepped into the place where everything had ended. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and faint smoke, carrying with it the echoes of a tragedy that had refused to leave. His eyes scanned the scene slowly, drinking in every detail. The overturned furniture, the faint stains, the shadows that seemed to cling to corners as if hiding secrets. And there, framed in that quiet darkness, stood the other man. Not with fear, not with anger, but with a stillness that held the weight of every choice he had ever made, every moment he had loved her in silence. In that instant, everything became clear. He had been there all along, every hidden step, every act of care, every sacrifice unnoticed and unacknowledged. She had loved him first, not for convenience, not out of obligation, but with a depth so constant, so raw, it had shaped every decision she had made after. He realized now that her silence had never been betrayal. She had been navigating hearts she could not control, making choices that were impossibly human, impossibly honest. Both men were present in that heavy moment, witnesses to a story that had always been more complicated than either had imagined. She had carried love for them both, in different ways, for different reasons, and her final act was a culmination of that truth. It was not revenge she had sought, not justice, not even clarity. It was a choice, hers alone, made in the quiet strength of a woman who had known loss, loyalty, and impossible longing. He saw it all, the tenderness she had reserved for him, the quiet constancy she had given to the other man, and the weight of everything left unspoken. It pressed against him like the night itself, suffocating, compelling him to understand, to accept, even if understanding brought pain that would never fade. She had loved them both, but she had also lived on her own terms, and in that final moment, he understood that the consequence of her love was not simple. It was layered, it was tragic, and it was beautiful in its impossibility. In that silence, heavy and complete, he felt the truth settle. The final act was not a punishment, not a conquest, but understanding. The story had ended, but the weight of her choices, her love, and the truth of that night would echo forever. He stood alone in the dim light, the aftermath of revelation pressing down on him like a tangible weight. The night outside stretched endlessly, yet inside him, time seemed suspended. Every memory of her, the curve of her smile, the way she had looked at him when she thought no one was watching, the warmth of her hand in his clashed violently with what he had just learned. Love, he realized, was never simple, never linear. It was a tangle of choices, sacrifices, regrets, and longings that could not be measured by right or wrong. He thought of the other man, quiet and constant, whose presence had lingered in the edges of her life, shaping her in ways he had never understood. Anger had once burned through him like fire, but now it felt different, complex, almost unbearable. How could someone love her so fiercely and yet not possess her? How could she have loved them both and still chosen her own path? The answers were not coming easily. They never did. Every heartbeat reminded him of the magnitude of what he felt: grief, longing, jealousy, and something that frightened him more than anger understanding. He understood, painfully, that her love had never been a betrayal. It had been a truth too large to contain in a single relationship, a depth that required more than one heart to hold it, and now, holding that knowledge, he felt the crushing weight of it. He sank to the ground, exhausted by emotions that had no release. Acceptance would not come quickly. It might never come fully. There would be no easy resolutions, no satisfying closure. He would carry her memory and the truth of her love for the rest of his life, tangled with his own longing and regret. And yet, in that unbearable complexity, there was also something sacred, something real, something that no amount of anger or loss could erase. In the silence, he whispered her name, not as a plea, not as a lament, but as a promise. To remember, to honor, to carry the weight of her love as a lesson, a burden, and a gift. The night held him, the stars watched silently, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that love was not about possession. It was about knowing, accepting, and carrying truth, even when it broke you. He rose slowly, each movement weighted with the knowledge he now carried. The forest, or room, or battlefield, depending on your cinematic framing, felt impossibly still. The killer stood before him, unflinching, no weapon drawn, no false bravado, only truth in his eyes. Every second stretched like an eternity, the air thick with the unspoken question. What now? He remembered the words she had left behind, fragments of her intentions, of her heart, of her life that no one had truly understood. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the three of them, himself, her memory, and the man who had loved her before him. The weight of her love pressed down, and with it came clarity. Revenge, that familiar fire that had driven him, no longer burned in simple black and white. It had been replaced by something more tangled, more profound, more human. Anger and grief still pulsed within him, but alongside them grew something else, understanding. The killer had loved her truly, deeply, quietly, and in doing so had shaped the life she had lived, the choices she had made, and ultimately, the world he now faced. Could he kill the man and claim justice? Could he forgive? Could he even allow himself the luxury of either choice without shattering what she had left behind? He stepped closer, the silence unbroken except for the subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm of their breaths. Words formed, then faltered, then formed again. He realized that revenge would never bring her back. Violence would never capture the essence of her, nor the fullness of the love she had held for them both. To strike would be to diminish her memory, to flatten it into something easier to digest, something less real. The other man met his gaze steadily. There was no fear there, only truth. And in that truth he saw the entirety of her life reflected not as he had wanted it to be, not as he had imagined, but as it had always been. Complicated, full, impossible to contain. For a long moment, he did nothing but watch, his chest tight, his hands trembling, and the enormity of his own choice settling like stone in his gut. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of all he had felt and learned. "I won't kill you." He paused. "Not because you deserve mercy, not because I forgive, but because she was never ours to possess. She was hers, and you loved her. That is something I can't undo." The other man nodded, relief subtle but profound. Neither spoke further. Words could not capture what had been revealed, nor the truth they now both carried. In that quiet understanding, something shifted, a release, a small, trembling step toward closure that neither could have anticipated. He turned to leave, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he carried no weapon, no plan for bloodshed, no intention of punishing. He carried only her memory, the lessons of her love, and the haunting, beautiful complexity of human hearts. The hunt had ended, but the story, her story, remained alive in him, indelible, unyielding, and full of questions that would never truly be answered. And in that silence, in that understanding, the audience is left with the one truth the story has been building toward. Love is never simple. Revenge is never pure. And sometimes, understanding is the most powerful and the most painful choice of all. The forest falls silent. The tension lifts, but the echoes of what happened remain. The mate walks away, not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with the weight of understanding. The memory of her, the love she gave, the choices she made lingers like a ghost, impossibly vivid, impossibly human. And the killer, he disappears into his own life, forever marked by what he did, forever carrying the quiet love that had guided him. Nothing is simple. Nothing is resolved neatly. The story doesn't end with satisfaction, it ends with reflection. Dear viewer, before we close, pause for a moment. Think of the choices, the love, the pain, the impossible truths we've explored together. Which would you choose if you were in their place? Could you forgive, or would you follow revenge? If this story has touched you, pulled at your heart, or made you question what love and loyalty truly mean, I invite you to support the channel. Hit the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your perspective matters. Share this story with someone who loves deep, emotional tales, because every voice helps these stories reach more hearts. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying through every twist, every revelation, and every heartbeat of this tale. And now, let us close this chapter, leaving the story alive in your mind, where love, loss, and the weight of choice will linger long after the screen fades to black.